I wish I had a bong servitor. Just a big walking, semi-autonomous water pipe. It packs itself. And it filters out its water occasionally. After the brutal skirmish, the bulk of the tech priests fled towards the Palladium, while Davian and surviving offerings regrouped outside the arena. It was on fire, she saw. Some of the congregation had broken the ambilic's scaffolding, and the great cauldron had rolled over on its side like a dying leviathan, spilling molten effluvia across the plascrete floor, letting it runnel down into the prison depths below to consume the bodies of their erstwhile gaolers. Others had taken rods and spars to the chemical fires, spreading them as far as they would go, or got into the explosives stored for later in the festivities, spilling their explosive entrails across the city and setting it to light. The center point of the priesthood's grand show of purity was now home only to differing degrees of colors of flame. The people saw around her just looked dazed now. Many, the genuinely sick and weak, looked as though the exhortation had almost done for them. But they were glad of it, she decided. Glad that they had turned upon the hand that oppressed them just this once. And now, the last fireworks echo had faded, and there was more thunder in the air. It came from the direction of the rail depot. The congregation is coming, she whispered to Sakiri. The woman was hunched in a ragged cloak she'd made from a red robe, stripped down from one of her victims. Another strip of crimson was skewed over her gaping eye socket. The eye the priest had taken from her. She crouched atop a truncated statue, some ancient tech priest immortalized in plascrete, and now missing everything above the waist. Many things are coming, the woman told her, then cocked her head. Tell them, not me. Them? Your troops, little general. Davian looked helplessly around at the former offerings, and they were indeed looking at her as a rescuer. She shrank from them. I can't. I'm not like that. I'm just a messenger. Is that so? I'm not Clarisse. I can't just speak. Not me, said Sakiri wryly. The Emperor made me to do, not talk. But these lost ones need words, and you'll have to find them. Look, Sakiri stood, bare toes hooking into the jagged stump of the statue, immediately commanding everyone's attention. Some of them even cheered her, but she spread her three hands out to quiet them. Freedom is the gift we're given, the second we're born. And the taskmasters, they take that from us 1 second later, she told them. Her voice was cracked and raw, her body a battlefield between fanaticism and fatigue. Freedom is the greatest thing in a universe made from chains. And it wasn't me who gave you your freedom. One hand lunged out like a serpent and caught Davian, hauling her to stand before Sakiri. This one braved the guns and the chains to spare us. This one was the divine emperor's agent. Now say, what Clarisse might say. Davian felt a kick inside her, as though some organ she'd never possessed was suddenly pumping. She looked into their faces, her own little congregation, and they were connected to her, souls speaking to her soul. My family, she thought. Blood of angels. Her mouth opened, and the words fell into it, ready to be used like tools to shape these battered wretches into instruments of divinity. Listen, she said, her high, thin voice finding new strength with each word. Can you hear our brothers and sisters? They're coming, even now. All those who've suffered under the Hollowmen. You want your freedom? That is the sound of freedom. What's the use of a life lived under the boots of the taskmasters? What's the point in being no more than a cog in their machine? Is this all we are? Fuel for their fires? By this point, her own fires had swelled her voice into a clarion call to arms. Better to end our lives in struggle than ground between their mechanisms, she continued. Better to die breaking their doors and tearing down their monuments. Those who die fighting for freedom, they die free. She was standing very straight, wondering what this force was that came and spoke through her, even as the words still came. We break the chains they put on us. We tear down the walls that keep us prisoner. The day of union is here. The day when we will cleanse the world of the taskmasters and cast them down. Our sacred duty to the emperor. She felt as though these were revelations being given to her, each new minted in the second before it burst from her lips. There is a time to worship with prayer and a time to worship with work. But today we worship by destroying the engines of the Hollowmen and breaking the hands that wield the whip. Better to die free and doing the emperor's will than live a slave. Do you hear me? They heard her. The cheers sounded as though 3 times as many people were gathered around her than Davian actually saw, and stronger and haler than any of them. Arm yourselves, she told them. Our brother and sisters are coming to coming to march on the Palladium, and they need our help. Here, Sakari threw her carbine to the closest. She had always preferred her pistols. Take their weapons. Take sticks and stones, if you've nothing more. Today you are warriors. Today, Davian shouted, you are the song of the many-handed emperor that shall follow when he brings his blessed union to Marad. An infallible truth she couldn't even put into words a second before. The emperor's angels speak through me. I am their instrument. I am filled with their grace until it overflows from me to all of you. I guess it's kind of hard to get this scene right. After any movie, they all just kind of seem like the scene after Gladiator, any scene coming out of an arena. Even Spartacus fell off, but that was more so because all the rules of that show were based around the arena. I guess it's just typically because the scale becomes so much more great after what happens inside the arena. But luckily, this book doesn't really suffer from that much. It's just this. I don't know. I guess this scene is Sekiri finding her will, but it's just Sekiri. Hmm. She almost feels like a sidekick in her own novel. It's weird. I guess that's just it's because most of it is her coming of age, but um the the good news is I mean Triskelion feels like it's actually his own character. That feels like it feels like Triskellion's actually the antagonist, sorry, the protagonist of this book. His thoughts, I don't know, I just seem so thoughtful, if you will. Whereas um poor Davian just I don't know. I guess I said earlier she doesn't. I guess she doesn't have a personality besides being a sleuth, being a slender sleuth. Um, and that's nothing wrong with it. It's just she's kind of a side character, and I've Triskelion. Maybe it's just because I can relate with Triskelion. He's a man of ambition, willing to make incredible risks on behalf of that. And maybe even having his ambitions cloud his judgment. That's definitely a great flaw to have, I think. If any flaw to have, because it's just so juicy. It's just so juicy. Um and I guess another part about Triskelion that allows me to connect with him is I didn't know exactly how things were gonna go down with him by the end of this book. He's basically arranging for a massive plot in which the long and the short of it is he holds back a bunch of troops while everyone rebels, and then he brings them in to save the day. That's his plan, and it's just like, okay, well, there's so many ways that could work out. Probably with him dying, but that's not necessary for the Genestealer people to get what they want. Which at this point, the stakes for them is just survival. Well, actually, no. Now that I say it like that, no, he made it clear to them that he would. They knew it anyways. Um, yeah, I like Triskelion more than Davian. Gee, but the great quality about Davian, and this is from a bigger, a more open meta perspective, is she's simply a looking glass to see into the perspective of the inhuman genestealer cults. It's hard really feeling any connection with these people, and she does that. So that she does incredibly well, actually. And I guess her personality is basically being a schizophrenic and then just playing into the schizophrenic part at the end, I guess. And that it's just done really well because no one's really done it and made me even think. You can even see myself there because at the end of the book, you know what happens at the end of the book. And for those that don't know, basically the aliens come to devour everyone. These are not the aliens. These are just mutants and traitors that bring the aliens. And you know that's going to happen, but you got to think, what's their justification for doing this? Don't they know? Don't they know what's going to happen? Wouldn't you do anything to change that just a little? But it's done well. It's done incredibly well. And to that end, I suppose Davian is a well written character. She's almost too well written, whereas Triskellion's more straightforward. He's just like a more of a straightforward character. She's more of an actual perspective. She's more like a floating camera, I guess. A floating camera. That's the better way to look at her. Today, Davian shouted, "You are the song of the many-handed emperor, and shall follow when he brings his blessed union to Murad." Obediently, they spread out and searched for weapons. Along the street or back in the ruins of the arena, Davian sagged back down on her stump. That, Sakiri croaked, is how it is done. And Davian opened her mouth to say that yes, of course it was. To bless Sakiri with that torrent of divine inspiration which had gripped her. But when the audience had dispersed, that fit had abandoned her too, and she could only tremble at the emptiness it had left behind, a void into which all those bitter truths could seep. Sakiri cocked an eye at her. What? Davian just shook her head, but Sakiri jabbed her with the claw. What? The tech priest who caught you, Davian whispered. He made me take him to the Magus. He told her to take to the streets. It's all to his plan. She waited for the blow, the curse, for Sakiri the hero to denounce her. Instead, the three-armed killer chuckled oddly. I think it is. But the Emperor is wiser than any priest. The Emperor is not used, and it is time for his faithful to show themselves. Why else would Clares send me to the Palladium in the first place? But Davian didn't dare say it, but Sakiri filled in the unspoken words. But I failed. I did. Came close, but failed still. And yet, the many-handed Emperor is giving me a second chance through you. The time is now. I can hear the angels singing to me from just on the other side of the warp. We must lift our voices in prayer from the shattered ruin of the Palladium, standing on the broken bodies of the taskmasters, or we'll just dwindle and become nothing. The tech priest, Davian whispered. When he had me, he talked about Xenos blood, a taint within us. He said we weren't blessed, that all we were was to feed an alien hunger. She felt like a heretic for saying it, and yet Sakiri's grin only grew wider, a kind of divine madness flickering at the edges. That is what the machine priests see, the woman whispered. But we know that we shall become one with the angels who carry us with them to the stars, and who wouldn't want to become one of and who wouldn't want to become even a small part of the divine rather than a slave to these hollow men. And Davian nodded, feeling the words resound in her, touching that part of her that was kin blood with Sakiri and being alchemized into inarguable truth. And by then the offerings had returned, with what weapons they could find, and she stood straight and called out to them. We march to tear down the Hollowmen, for the people of Marad, for the Emperor, for the end of days. The Scutari at the rail depot were in full retreat by the time Davian saw them. Sakiri doubled her pace instantly, her clear voice raised in furious challenge, so that she and her ragged cohort caught one squad even as it tried to pull out, descending on them from behind. The embattled cyborgs were ruthlessly dragged down and disassembled into meat and metal. Sakiri came out of the fray with 2 more pistols than she'd gone in with, and plenty more of the offerings had taken a carbine from the hands of the enemy. They found one of the aunts carrying a banner, and Sakiri pulled her up on the smoldering chassis of a downed Cataphren that still had one mechanical arm raised, as though to ward off the next blow. Before them milled the far greater crowd of congregation members, miners, and Factorum workers. Where was Clarisse? The Magus was elsewhere, urging on some other part of the crowd. There was only her. Again, the youth that was Davian shied away from being their massed attention. But then she could hear the singing, just an echo of it, coursing in her blood. She thrilled to it, even as it terrified her. Zeno's taint, Juskilin had said, and she had an image of vast wings unfurling in the void, ravenous jaws, and segmented limbs. Hunger. For that song was all about hunger. It was terrible, but it was beautiful. To be part of something greater, to go on forever. And better the angels and all their fearful glory than the engines of the tech priests. If we are to be ground and devoured, I choose the jaws. Death! Davian cried out to all their gaunt and dirty faces. Death is the wage of every life. Death when their machines crush you. Death when their poisons sicken you. When you can't work anymore and they cut your food and water in the name of their efficiency. We all die, friends. So let us die in glorious struggle. Let us die with our hands about their throats. Let our deaths go to feed something grander than their furnaces. The words found her lips, one by one without forethought, each exactly right. Not their filthy machines, not their hollow creed. For if we live and die for the Emperor, then the Emperor's angels shall carry us with them forever. And in that, we shall never die. They surged forwards, took 3 districts, breaking windows and setting fires, before the Scutari showed their metal faces again, blocking them at Formulatus Plaza with a great show of red-robed force. They had barricades up, and the soldiers knelt and stood behind them, and their backs were the 4-legged bulks of 2 dune-crawler tanks, dented and scarred from forcing their way through narrow streets. They opened fire through the monument the moment the insurgents came into sight. But by then, the wave of revolution was converging on the square from several routes, and there was plenty of cover. And they had more than just crude guns and knives. They'd hauled up heavy mining gear and the armored Goliath rock grinders, lasers and cutters, even homemade launchers that lobbed mining charges high overhead to impact down amongst the close-packed red. And there were the aunts and uncles, of course. There were the great aunts and great uncles, out under the sun for the first time in living memory. They were swift and hunched and deadly, swarming up the walls of neighboring buildings, leading the charge before the many-handed banner. They scrambled over the barricades with an inhuman agility. The Scutari only had a couple of hurried volleys before it was knife and talon against their gun butts and power swords. Sakiri was in the thick of it, dancing like lightning through the fray, with her pistols blazing, and Davian trying to keep at her heels, dragging into the thick of the fighting by the song in her head. All around her, the aunts and uncles were tearing into the metal lines of the Scutari, ripping open the red of their robes to get back at the oil beneath. She saw hooked talons shear through steel, distended jaws catch about the metal face of one soldier and tear it away, lenses and conduits and all, revealing beneath where all that augmentation had been set into weak, raw flesh. And then a gun butt struck her shoulder, and she was knocked from Sakiri's shadow, stumbling back over the scorched body of a great aunt. Scutarius stood over her, mechanically leveling his weapon, and over his head spoke the great heavy guns of a doomcrawler. Davian looked frantically left and right for help, but in that instant all she could see were the bodies of the fallen, dead workers in bloodied overalls and torn protective gear, dead ants with their purplish carapaces cracked, their jaws agape. The tide of battle was eddying, and the red-robed metal soldiers pushed back. She knew fear, but then it was transformed into a blazing white rage, an emotion that came from elsewhere to fill her to the brim. The hilt of something was under her hand, and she took it up, a curved knife inscribed with the many-hand emperor's own image. The carbine spat fire that seared her shoulder, but she was in past its barrel even as the shot came, ramming the blade into every part of the soldier she could reach, and careless of what might come after. She struck steel and then flesh, feeling a mad strength guide her hand. And more than that, she felt all the others, her kin, her congregation. As they struck, they so rallied, as though her hands were knitting them all back into a unified mass. As the soldier stumbled away from her, her people surged forwards on either side, hammering into the Scutari, so that their lines bent and broke, and those at the back began to flee. On terms of combat, I think, yeah, this guy is about as mediocre as G.S. Soto that wrote the Dawn of War novel adaptations. It's just so like mechanical, kind of. It's so kind of mechanical. I mean, I'm glad it doesn't go on for too long, but as a saving grace, it's always the context, the drama that sets up the battle that makes it interesting because there's stakes involved. Otherwise, you would just read a book that was, I mean, you'd read a novel, right? That was all just a battle. And that could be interesting in itself, but it's all about context, you see. I mean, everyone has an opinion on the world wars. Everyone does. Especially normies. They have an opinion on both world wars, even though they probably know nothing about the first one. They have it's something that everyone has an opinion about. So everyone kind of has a stake, you know, it's that context. Yeah, no, it's Soon after, she watched as Uncle Edark himself scaled the smoke belching dune crawler and torn off its top hatch, hauling out a pilot still connected to the machine by twisted umbilicals, and then tearing out the man's remaining innards before the crowd. By then, the Formulatus Plaza belonged to the congregation, and the Scutari were in full flight. And now we move on, you and I, Sakiri decided, one ridgy hand on Davian's shoulder. We have work to do. What work? I thought you wanted to see your brother, the woman said. There's also the matter of the gates of the Palladium Wall, which will stand even against the mining lasers unless we can open them. And I was given a target, and that target remains aggravatingly alive. They will have the Palladium sealed tight, for the man is a coward. I will get us to the Palladium. You can get us within the walls. Hey, Foreman! Her voice cut to the sudden roar of dirt cycle engines as the subject of her cry drove up. He was a lean, bald man, a sweat-drenched headband about his grimy forehead. He was one of the congregation, a generation older than Davian, one younger than Sakiri. Davian knew him, the foreman of a team of prospectors who ranged the rocky wilds, searching for untapped veins to mine. Italian jackals who lived most of their lives without tech priest supervision and had always been covert heroes to her and Neem. Now he pulled up on his grumbling bike with a long rifle over his shoulder and a half dozen riders at his back. I heard you were dead, he told Sakiri, with the ease of long association. You'll live in my shadow for a full few days yet, she shot back. Get us to the Palladium, her and me. There's fighting enough here for all of us. Too orky. There's fighting enough here for all of us, the Pharaoh told her. My goodness. There's fighting enough here for all of us, Ronan told her. The many-handed emperor wills it, Davian snapped. For a moment, both Sakiri and Pharaonin stared at her, and she waited for them to slap her down. But then the man leant back in the saddle and barked a word to his fellows, who guided their bikes closer, nudging them through the crowd. We ride, Pharaonin told his soldiers. Sakiri, get up behind me. She can go with a Marco there. Davian got up gingerly, behind the designated rider, trying to fit between the man and his panniers packed with mining charges, loose fuses dangling and hanging. One stray shot, she thought. But then Pharaonin had yelled out another command, and they were tearing off at a target to the insurgents' main advance, weaving through the streets of Arctority's wealthy center, the places that people from South Chasm were never supposed to see. But when they passed by a bronze statue of some superannuated agency or another, Marco hacked its head off with his power axe. Davian let out a high yell of triumph. She could feel the man laughing through the grip she had around his waist. They met one band of Scutari on the way, belatedly rushing to reinforce Formulatus Plaza. Pharaonin took himself up and overpassed, separating from his people, who just roared ahead, One of the riders was struck down, a scatter of carbine shot punching him out of the saddle and sending his limp form sprawling to the dust. The rest were on the Scutari before they could get another round off, hacking and beating, shooting them at point blank range with pistols and shotguns. The Scutari Alpha had a power sword with an edge that spat and seethed with undirected energy, and he hacked to the aft of a Marco's axe, sending the head spinning away. The blade was drawn back for another blow, the Alpha's face unreadable beneath the steel slit of his helm. Then there was a hole punched past the rim of that slit, and the man was down. Feronin was shooting from the overpass, calmly picking off each individual enemy as they tried to fall back to a new position. Soon after that, they were pulling in within sight of the palace, the remaining bikes pulling up in the shadow of one of the administrative archives. Davian and Sakiri slipped from behind their respective riders and took stock. Down along the broad front of the building, she could see there were Scutari outside the main gate. Not so many, and for a moment she thought Feronin might just charge them here and now, relying on shock and fury to overcome their numbers. She backed off from the bikes, braced for the sudden roar of their engines. Instead, Feronin said, "I have a fight to get back to." "The Emperor smiles on you," Sakiri told him, a hand on his shoulder. "We'll be in his embrace soon, one way or another." "I long for it," he said. "An end to work, an end to pain, a return to the arms of our blessed Father." Isn't that what we used to say when we were young? For a moment, his lean, creased face was oddly vulnerable. "Is it now, Sakiri? Is it really the promised day?" And Davian knew the answer was no, because all this had been set off by some scheming tech priest. Tomorrow would see them at Triskelion's mercy. And yet Sakiri just squeezed the man's shoulder and said, "We must all have faith." Davian felt as though she were two people. The one whose very blood burned with an inarguable faith, and the other with a mind sick with worry that she had betrayed everyone for a tech priest's game. She watched as the bikes roared into life and sped away. If you are familiar with Warhammer 40,000, you'll probably know that each of these characters is basically acting exactly as they would in the game. It's odd. In fact, it's almost satisfying how predictable they are, and it's kind of funny actually, because I think they all know. I think everyone except Davian knows that this is just a game, that they're just pieces in a game. Like they've been made to do something specific, and that's all they'll do is that specific thing. But they don't have to worry. They don't have any like what's life about, because they know, and it's not even like they know. Their entire world and mind is shaped within specific parameters for them to fit like a certain role. Like the Italian jackals, just dirt bike guys. One of them has a sniper rifle and they throw bombs at people. And I mean, they do that right here, but it's almost, I guess, in a way for me, it's almost comical because it makes me feel smarter. And I see now why. I see now why this novel is so good. Is it fulfills the secret directive of the novels remarkably well. In fact, probably better than really any of the other ones. And that is, Warhammer wants to sell products, and this is a fantastic advertisement for those products. I think if I hadn't been duped by so many years, I'd be duped already. I'd be carried away by the fantastic lore that supports the world and the products behind it. That's not quite the case, though. It's kind of like chaos in a way. I know how far to get into it, and I think I get just far enough, because once you start getting carried away, then you start making decisions Okay, you start making decisions that are based on other decisions. You start making these precedences that build on one another. And it's easy to get stuck in a corner when you think like that. It's so easy to be contained to one thought process, almost like these freaks. It's almost like the game does this to you eventually. Is it just gets you, it gets you interested in it, and then you, yeah.